Like everyone says you should write blog posts, but the problem is you've got to spend a lot of time because they've got to be technically interesting, and you have to do it for 12 months, 18 months before you even see any results. Most people give up before they start seeing the results. Technical founders in particular would love to build the product, but it's the easier bit of building a startup.
Hi everyone, you're listening to Scaling DevTools. I'm joined today by David Mytton from Arcjet and also console.dev. Thanks, David, for joining.
No problem. Great to see you.
Yeah, great to see you. And I should say that we bumped into each other in an office and we were like, okay, why don't we just do this? So,
yeah, completely unplanned, but I've been listening to the podcast for ages. So yeah, we're excited to be on.
Yeah, and I've been listening to your podcast as well, and console.dev one, which, yeah, I want to see more episodes, actually.
Yeah, I know. Getting into running a startup full time, have had less time to do console.dev, and the podcast newsletter's still going.
Yeah.
But the podcast, like, you know how much work it is.
So, yeah. So David, could you tell us a bit about Arcjet?
Arcjet is a tool to help developers protect their apps once they go into production. So if you think pre-prod and prod, pre-prod is your writing code. There's lots of tooling, whether it's something like SEMGRET for static analysis or GitHub's code scanning. There's lots of tools to help you protect your code as you're writing it and writing bad code, essentially. But once you push your code into production, then there's not as much for developers. You probably use Cloudflare or maybe Fastly or Akamai to do network level protections. And those are really good tools, but they're just not built for developers. They sit at the network edge, so they don't really know anything about your code, your application. They don't have the context of the request, and they don't work in the development environment. You can't test them locally. And so you'll often find that you write your app, you build it all, push it to production, and then you turn on the security stuff and it breaks things. Yeah. And the idea with Arcjet is it sits in your application at the middleware layer and your API routes, and it integrates into your code. So you can test things locally, you can test it in staging, test it in CI. And then when it goes into production, it's actually providing things like rate limiting, bot protection, to email validation, and detect attacks and help prevent your site breaking.
Yeah, that's really, really powerful. And like, what do you find like people are coming for like specific cases where people are like, yeah, we need Arcjet?
Yeah, we've built these core primitives. The bot detection, if you want that, you can just use it by itself. If you want rate limiting, you can use that. But you can also compose them. They're kind of composable primitives. And so you can build all the rules together. And what we've found is that developers are not really thinking about security challenges, but they're really thinking about problems that they're facing once their apps go into production. So spam signups, or they're getting loads of free accounts and they want to prioritize their paid users on their API, give different quotas. And so we're seeing a lot of use of the bot protection and also the ability to do dynamic rate limits based on pricing plan or who's logged into your application. Yeah,
that makes total sense. I was speaking to someone that was like having loads of spam, like people were like requesting phone like verification, like the two-factor auth one.
Yeah, and it's expensive, right?
Yeah,
sending SMSs all the time.
Yeah,
so you need to rate limit that. You want to prevent automated clients from submitting forms, and really a human will only submit a form. Well, ideally they'll submit it once because they'll be successful, but maybe you have a typo in your email address and you can detect that. So maybe a couple of times. Anything more than that is probably suspicious. And you may not necessarily want to block it. You might want to just flag it for human review. And the idea with Arcjet is you get these signals in your code so you can change the logic of your code based on what we're detecting rather than kind of like a brute force block or allow on the network.
Yeah, that makes total sense. You've been working on Arcjet for, it's like a year or two?
Yeah, just over a year ago. June 2023.
Yeah. And so when I first came across your work, David, it was actually with Console before, and which is amazing, and people should subscribe. It's like, if you're looking for like DevTools newsletter, like console.dev is awesome.
Thanks.
And there's podcast and it's great. So I kind of was curious about like the journey from like Console to Arcjet.
Yeah, well, if you go back just a little bit further, the first company that I started, Server Density, in 2009 was a server monitoring product, so like Datadog and New Relic. And we built that in 2009 and then sold it in 2018. Obviously, a lot happened in the intervening years, but sold it in 2018 to StatPath. They're a large security platform and have like had a huge ed network. They actually went bankrupt last month. I left in 2019.
Yeah,
so nothing to
your
do
hands
with me.
are clean.
Yeah. So sold to them, joined as part of the acquisition, stayed there for 18 months, and then left and did a master's degree in environmental technology at Imperial in London, and focused on sustainable computing, like the energy consumption of data centers, cloud computing, that kind of stuff. And then finished the master's degree and decided that I wanted to get back into tech. It's kind of what I really love doing. Played around with a lot of sustainable technology as well, but decided to start console.dev just because there just wasn't anywhere that developers could go to find out about the best tools. Like you can go on Hack News and there's stuff there, but it's not really specifically for tools.
You have to look through it and filter.
Yeah, and there's no control over what shows up. You'll get really interesting stuff, but it might not necessarily be DevTools related that you want to try out. And so just in the period of 2009 to when we started Console in 2020, there was a massive explosion in the number of tools and companies and open source, everything just trying to push tools to developers. And so it was very difficult to know not just where to find things, but also what you should pay attention to.
Yeah.
And as an experienced developer, it's very difficult. Like your time is very limited. You want to play around with stuff, but a lot of stuff is just not that good.
Yeah.
And so the idea behind the newsletter was that I would pour the work in and try everything out. And then the newsletter is 3 very short reviews, 300 characters of what we like, 300 characters of what we don't like. So I spent 4 years just playing around with DevTools every day, writing reviews, getting to know founders who are building things, open source developers who are building stuff on the side. Yeah. And then in parallel to that, I was getting into the security side of software and doing hacking challenges and learning about how insecure everything is. Yeah. And it was through that I started thinking, well, what's the developer tooling like for security? And as I said earlier, like you've got there's a lot of stuff as you're writing code, but that's only half of what you need to do. You've got to actually deploy your application. And then it wasn't as good. Like where's the Vercel of security or the super base of security? In those 2 examples are just one of many examples of really high quality developer tools where the developer experience is really the most important thing. And you can deploy code in seconds, and then there's all these features and it's got amazing design and it works really well for developers. And there was just nothing like that for security. And so I decided I'd prototype it. WebAssembly was becoming really interesting at the time. And part of the Arcjet architecture is there's a WebAssembly component that runs in the SDK. And so we can do a lot of the analysis locally on your server, not WebAssembly in the client, in the browser, which is what most people think of with WebAssembly, like Figma is the famous example. But we run WebAssembly on your server and we can do a lot of analysis inside that security sandbox with very high performance analysis of what's going on. And I decided to build that and started it last year.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I have questions on that journey, but I just wanted to say something that was like, that I think says a lot about you and about how you run, is that one of my friends, good friends, is like running a dev tool, and I won't name them, but their dev tool is like really good now and it's amazing and they're getting like tons of customers. But at some point, it was like the early stages, and in their own words, like it was pretty janky. Yeah. and they tried to sponsor console.dev, and I think you actually returned the money to them because you were like, yeah, it's just not quite good enough to be in there. And I really thought that was like showed like a ton of like integrity actually, and it was just like really kind of a cool aside for anyone.
Thanks. That's funny to hear it on the other side. I do remember so the idea is it's things that I like, and so I review them, and I only put good things in there. And I applied the same with the sponsors. Right? It's sponsored, you can pay, and it prioritizes me looking at your tool because we have quite a long backlog. But it's not pay to play. You can't just pay to be in the newsletter. And which
is kind of like one of those things where like everyone says, but like you actually
okay, well, it's good that you got a real example of us actually returning the money to someone. Yeah. And it's not like we'll never include it. Like products evolve and things progress. But I kind of copied that from Tim Ferriss, where I don't know whether he actually does this, but it feels like on his podcast, the adverts are only for the things that he uses. Yeah. And he uses a lot of really interesting things, and he gets paid a lot of money for some of them. Yeah. And I always thought that it still feels like that's how he does it. And having that integrity means that you can have an audience who trusts you. And when there is a sponsored review in there, it is an honest review. And we always include what we like and what we don't like, but it's always going to be stuff that I think is worth your time.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really cool. So then going back to what you were saying about the origins of Arcjet, could you tell us a bit about like, yeah, the initial, like, how did you get it out there, like, initially? And yeah.
Well, this is the hardest bit, and it's something I've seen. So I've made a few DevTools Angels investments, and it's something I've seen through Console is technical founders in particular would love to build the product, spend all the time on the technology. And it's not that it's easy, but it's the easier bit of building a startup because 50% of it is a product, 50% of it is just the go-to-market and getting it in the hands of developers. And it's just really, really difficult. Like developers they're not immune to marketing because they love trying new things, but they don't like marketing that is very obvious or really cliche or horrible. And so it's just a lot of effort and time put into things that probably are no surprise, like write blog posts. Like everyone says you should write blog posts, but the problem is you've got to spend a lot of time because they've got to be technically interesting. And you have to do it for 12 months, 18 months before you even see any results. And most people give up before they start seeing the results. There are some companies that do this really well, like Superbase is amazing at their technical blog posts. Fly.io is really good. Tailscale are really good. And they will talk about their product, but they're really just talking about the interesting technical things that they've solved. Cloudflare, they're kind of a competitor to Arcjet, but they're an example I use all the time of their blog. Like it's run by the CTO. He has the last say in everything. He was on the Console podcast a couple of years ago now, but John Graham Cummings, he was on the podcast and we talked a little bit about this. And their blog posts are amazing. And they go into the technical detail of how they run a network of 300 plus data centers and deal with something like 15 million requests a second through their network, if not more. And developers love that stuff. And I think for them, that's been a really good recruiting mechanism to get people who want to work at Cloudflare, but also just to get people who would want to use that product. And that's the kind of principle that you need to create content. So, and content as a word has been labeled negatively, I think, because people think, oh, content is just like turning out SEO fluff. But it's content in the sense of really interesting stuff that people want to read. And the same with videos. That's huge now. YouTube is a really important channel for a certain type of developers. And then podcasts as well. Podcasts are really important. Podcasts are very hard to grow. I'm sure you found that it's just, it just takes long. It's similar to blog posts. So you've got to put out good content consistently. And so that's really difficult. And then influencers as well. And you're an influencer now. And there's influencers that people have heard of, like celebrities and pop stars, but there's influencers in the DevTools community. And you think it's a niche, but they've got hundreds of thousands of subscribers and it makes a real difference. So it's all these things, getting it out. And then you've also got to have a really good product.
And so are you, in terms of like, if you're thinking about like, blog, like, are you writing a lot of content currently?
So my goal is to do a blog post a week. We've got a DevRel on the team, and he's writing a blog post a week as well. And I try and encourage the team to write blog posts. It's hard to get engineers to do it just because it's not their job, really. They're obviously building the product and they're writing code, and it's quite a different discipline, writing prose than writing code. But some engineers are great at it. And those are some of the most interesting blog posts because they're actually writing about the things that they've built. So I'm writing blog posts every week.
And do you have like a process like to do it?
It depends on what I'm writing about. Often I'll have no idea at all, and then I'll come up with an idea and I'll write the blog post in 3 or 4 hours, and it will go
like
out.
It just kind of has to come out of you. I feel like sometimes.
But when I look back on the blog posts that are done really well, it's writing about something that has taken me a long time to solve technically. So a recent one was we wanted to put redaction into our Go logging on the server because we log a lot of data about the request, but we don't want to put information into the logs, so personal information, IP addresses, all that kind of stuff, because it goes into, we use Datadog, goes into Datadog for a bit, and then it goes into long-term storage and just GDPR compliance. If someone wants to remove part of their personal information that you put in there, you've now got to figure out, where is it all gone? And so we wanted to put data redaction into our Go logs. And there wasn't an easy way to do that. and there were a couple of ways that used Go's reflection API, but when I did it, the performance wasn't great.
Yeah.
It added a couple of milliseconds to the overall execution, which doesn't sound like a lot, but our API's SLA is 20 milliseconds full response time for making a security decision. So if we're doing 4 milliseconds of logging, that's like 25% of the budget. And so we wanted to reduce that. And so I spent quite a lot of time investigating different ways to do log reduction and found a really good option and then wrote about it. And that post has been like, people Google for that because it's hard to do. And then we also had the exact same challenge with Next.js and how do you do logging to JSON in Next.js? And they don't make it easy out of the box. There's a couple of libraries that in JavaScript that make it possible, but they don't quite work with Next.js out of the box. And there's some config tweaks you have to do. So that one is not quite as complicated. You can figure it out in an hour or two. But that's an hour or two of developers' time that might just write a blog post and provide the solution.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like it's just this process of like every time you do something, reflect like.
Yep. Every time you do anything, I think, unless it's just like setting up Next.js's template, probably take some notes and then write a quick blog post. And that's probably the easiest way to get started because you've already done most of the work, which is the technical bit. And then you can just write about it. And I also find that until I've written about something, I haven't completely solved the problem because it's I probably understand it by writing about it.
I feel like sometimes as well, like I don't know if it's maybe this is slightly different, but this is more for like the onboarding stuff or like guides and things of like how to set things up. Is like I feel like it also forces you to reflect on like every step of like we don't make this that clear actually.
Right. Did you have someone on your podcast recently talking about this, like the onboarding side of things? I remember listening to that episode, and it's like you build it once and then no one ever uses it from your team again. But it's the first thing that every single one of your users uses. And I think there's something about having the CEO own that bit, the onboarding bit, and just doing it every single week. First thing Monday morning, sign up for your own product on a new email address and see what it's like.
I feel like it's like so many like things that are just like so basic that's like you might go back to like this big article and like we had where like the Docker image was out of date, but then like just stuff like that where like and things have changed and it's
onboarding, like, quick starts, like the first bits in the docs, things change all the time. And you want your developers to write documentation at the same time, but maybe it's in a different repository and they forgot to do the PR correctly, or they just didn't think about it, or they haven't had time to do it, or there's a rush to get something out. And there's all these reasons why you can't always sync the docs with a release. And so you need someone whose job it is, or at least they have the responsibility to test that on a regular basis.
And that's the CEO.
I think it should be the CEO. Even up to hundreds of people. I think the CEO should sign up to their product. Every week. Mystery shopper type approach. Like actually use your products. Do the emails make sense? Do they come out? And how does that all, like what is the messaging around it? How does it look? All that, because it's part of the experience. I think probably countries should do the same thing when you enter the country through the border. So you're coming as a tourist to a country and the first person you see is a kind of surly border agent. That they should be, like some of them are really great, but also some of them are not. And if you've been on a 12-hour flight, it's the same kind of thing, isn't it? You're a developer, you haven't got much time, you want to solve a problem.
That's a good way to think about it.
You need to sign up for the product.
Yeah, that's such a good way to think about it. That's amazing. And then, so you are someone who's like, if you think about like DevTools founders, like you understand content, I think, more than like the top 0.001% of people, right? Probably because of console.dev. Do you think, so you've got the blog posts, are you also doing like newsletters and stuff?
Yeah, so we do a monthly newsletter. So you sign up to the product and you get subscribed to that. And that started out just sending interesting links about security. But I now put like a short editorial type opinion piece in there just to make it interesting. And that was an idea I stole from Fly.io's newsletter. They just started sending one out. Maybe the second one has gone out as we speak. And that was really interesting because they've got a very certain type of messaging and how they describe things. They're very informal. They describe things in a very technical way,
Yeah.
and that is also in their newsletter. And when the first time I received it, like there was this big description of how they do DevRel, I think, and then in their one that's just gone out this month, it was just all about their billing system that they've rebuilt from scratch, which is a very like niche and specific thing to fly. Like no one's going to use that. No one's going to see it as a product or the code other than when they get billed. But the fact that they're talking about it in their newsletter is really interesting. And so then they talk about the product, and then there's some other links that they put in there. And I thought that I should do the same thing, like find something interesting in written form, provide some interesting links. And then the last thing in the newsletter is what's updated in the product. Because like developers don't like getting emails. If you've ever emailed a developer, it's very difficult to get them to respond.
Yeah.
And particularly if you're trying to get something from them, like if you have a product or you want to get feedback, they don't like responding. And so it's a privilege to be able to have access to their email address to get in their inbox. And so I feel like when we send them something, it should be something they actually want to read. And then the side benefit is, this is by Arcjet, and here's what the product's happening to the product. And hopefully people will stay subscribed to the newsletter, even if they're not using the product yet.
Yes.
And then hopefully in the future, stay top of mind. Every single month they're seeing something interesting from us.
And I think like, is there like a kind of, do you consciously think about what you want people to feel about Arcjet? Or
we have done, we spent a bit of time thinking about it, because the word Arcjet, when I was coming up with the name for the company, I literally had list of Wikipedia entries of like all the engineering terms, all the science, all the physics terms, and I went through every single one. I was like, does the domain exist? Is there a startup? Is there a trademark? And Arcjet, there was nothing. There's something in Fallout, the game Fallout, called Arcjet.
Really?
And then also NASA has an experimental electrical jet propulsion engine for spacecraft called an Arcjet.
That's quite a good connotation for...
So that's what we wanted to use. We wanted kind of sci-fi and space and futuristic. And so a couple of weeks ago, we started discussing this properly to like make sure our branding and how we talk about the company and how we do our design has that feel without it being cliche. Because a lot of DevTools have a very similar feel. And so we're conscious of not seeming the same, but also taking this kind of futuristic space type feel, which is linked to the name.
Yeah, and because I always felt like console.dev has like a really strong brand. It's like very...
That was luck, like the domain was available. We just registered console.dev.
I actually meant more like in the terms of like, just everything is very like kind of congruent and
or with the lines.
And then also like just the way you like write about things matches like the brand, and it just feels very like, I don't know, like well done. I don't know.
That's good. That's good to hear. The console branding, we put a lot of effort into the design of that, like the website and the custom email template as well. Make sure it works on dark mode, make sure it works on light mode, and just having kind of this kind of a neon feel. And we did that in 2020 before neon became cool. It was cool in like the 70s and the 80s, and then it wasn't cool, and now it is cool again. I feel like we were a little bit ahead of that.
You made it cool again.
Yeah, I'll claim that. But it's kind of how I write about things. And then Arcjet is a bit more, we put a bit more time into figuring that out because it's a bigger team. Console is just me doing the writing, and then my co-founder who does kind of the back office side of things, and our limited amount of marketing that we do as well.
Yeah. And I guess like the question I guess I have as well is like, were there any things that you learned from console.dev that you like have been applying directly into Arcjet?
I think we talked a little bit about the go-to-market. That was a big learning, and just how important that is. Like I spend 100% of my time on that now, and then
100% on
pretty much 100% on go-to-market. It's 100% on go-to-market, and then another 20% on running everything else. It's, it's like the CEO bits. Like, I've got to review the accounts for our UK subsidiary today, and then the next day I'm reviewing a PR, and now I'm deploying something to AWS and figuring out how to set up Kubernetes. It's like all these completely different tasks. But I'm trying to spend 100% of my time on go-to-market, and that's the biggest thing I've learned from console. But the other big thing was just around the importance of the developer experience, and we talked about the tools that don't get into console. Those are probably the ones that have the most interesting things to learn about. The ones that aren't, I don't think are very good. And why is it? Because it's not that there's a different amount of effort.
Yeah.
So developers are building stuff and they're putting in a lot of time and effort. And just because I don't think it's good isn't anything it's not an aspersion on them as developers. It's just they haven't quite reached the level of quality that is needed today to attract developers. And it kind of goes back, when I started server density in 2009, server monitoring, like Datadog didn't exist, and it was tools like Nagios and Monit and these sysadmin developed tools where it is very utilitarian. It does the job, but it looks awful. And that has changed completely today, where you expect the level of experience from Vercel in all of your tools. And just to focus on the DX is super important. And that means everything from the onboarding through to the docs are organized and all the code samples. I wrote all of our documentation at the very beginning. Now our team help as well, but every single code example, we've probably got 200 code samples in the docs that I've created for TypeScript and JavaScript. And Next.js has got the app router and the pages router, and they're both supported. So we've got 4 code examples for every single feature and component in the product. And it's really tedious doing that. But it's that kind of effort, putting the amount of effort into the code that you write, also into the packaging of everything.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. It's like you almost become like I guess you're the one that's actually just like, poking it and just like constantly making sure that everything is like
consistent and it works. And not just like the quick start works. That is also important, has to work, but everything that branches out from that, because developers start with a quick start, but then they go a lot deeper. And this is often where it's called the graduation problem, where you fall out of that quick start and now the docs aren't there and there's functionality that you don't know how to use, or it doesn't work, or there's very common scenarios that just aren't covered. And it's thinking through all these different things, and there's no, like, we haven't got it right. And there's no way to get it 100%. You just got to keep going and trying it out, and then you'll get feedback from a user using it in some crazy way that you never thought of. And then you've got to support that as well.
I think when I like started the podcast and before I'd done like tried to build my own stuff, like I feel like it's really easy to like underappreciate like how much those kind of basics are like not, are like really hard to do. And
it's the stuff behind the scenes.
It's rare.
Like, and if you don't do it, you notice, people will notice. But if you do it right, then no one notices because it's what they're expecting.
And it's like, I don't really know how we grew. How did we grow? Like, just
I know
people just used it, but maybe it's all the work that you do where it's just making it amazing.
Right. It's all the work, and then you also don't know which thing you did actually had the real impact. And then 5 years later, when someone asks you, you create a narrative around what it was, and maybe that was it, maybe it wasn't. But also the 5 years is a long time. Things have changed. So there's a lot of, I think, common things that you need to do, like we're talking about with writing blog posts on a regular basis. But there's a lot of new things that come up, like influencers. That's pretty new. Last 4 or 5 years, really. That's a new thing. Certainly in tech and DevTools, that's a new thing. And there'll be something else in 5 years' time when you're doing how many episodes you're in to this podcast and you're talking about what works. There'll be something new then.
And have you tried working with influencers yet with Arcjet?
It's very difficult to get in. And I think it's like kind of like selection bias. Once you're in with one well-known influencer, then the others will see, and you get this credibility. And so I think it's kind of like the cold start problem.
Interesting.
And
so it's actually hard to get.
It's hard to get
them
them
kind of take your money in a sense.
They just don't reply to emails, or they're just not interested, or they think the product's too early. And these are all legitimate things, and it's good that you can't just pay to be mentioned by an influencer, because otherwise they wouldn't have the audience because people would trust them. And so we've been spending a lot of time working on it and trying to understand how to do it. And got some really great angel investors on the Arcjet cap table that have been helpful with that. But I think it's just continuous. It's all part of how the product is, like the amount of time you've been in the market, who's using it, the kind of scale you're at, and then just engaging with people. And it's also, it can't be a transactional thing. I think it's not just pay some money and then they'll talk about your product and then you're done. I think you need to be useful. You need to be seen to be in the community. You need to participate. And then they want to work with you at some point. But I think we're still pretty early in that. So check back in a year or two and we'll see how it's gone.
Yeah, that's super, super interesting. Okay, David, that was amazing. Like, we've wanted to chat for ages, I think, and it's kind of so cool that we just bumped into each other.
Yeah, funny to be in San Francisco rather than London.
Yeah. Where can people learn more about Arcjet and about you?
Arcjet.com, that's the website, and blog.arcjet.com. And then for me personally, it's davidmytton.blog. I don't write as much as I used to on my personal blog. It's mostly about sustainable computing now. And my research on that has kind of dialed down as I've focused on other things. So console.dev will be the other thing as well. Subscribe to the DevTools newsletter.
Okay, amazing, amazing. Thanks everyone for listening. Thank you, David, for joining.
Thanks a lot.